Hello and welcome to Remember Palestine with me, Lauren Booth. In today's programme we look at how the Palestinian concept of their struggle for recognition has changed in over 62 years of dispossession and occupation. Here's an overview of today's topic.
In the early 20th century, Palestinian identity and sense of nationhood began to develop. However, following the First World War and the occupation of the region by the British, the colonial powers drafted the British Mandate for Palestine. The Mandate for Palestine was an historical League of Nations document which was a legal commission for the administration of Palestine. This was one of the stepping stones towards the Palestinian people's dispossession of their land. Over the past 60 years, Palestinian nationalism has relied on international law for their struggle, but the struggle has had many divisions and developments that in turn changed the narrative of its people. John Strawson's Partitioning Palestine argues that the plight of Palestine remains a colonial issue, and that legal tools are used to undermine Palestinian self-determination.
Joining me now in our London studio is Professor John Strawson, author of that book, Partitioning Palestine, published earlier this year. Welcome to Remember Palestine. Now, partitioning is such an enormous subject, but you say in your book that colonialism is still to blame for the problems today in Israel-Palestine. Can we just take a little look at the damage done by the redrawing of the page in the 1920s and 30s in Palestine?
Well, I think there's two levels at which colonialism still hangs very heavily over the conflict, which first of all is the impact of the 1920s. And if you read the mandate that the British essentially wrote for themselves but was given to them by the League of Nations in a formal way, you look at that document and you see that the Palestinians, or the Arab population of Palestine as they were described at the time, were at the peripheries of this, that the main task of the mandate is the creation of the Jewish national home, and that the identity and the national identity of the Arab population is simply never mentioned within that document, and only by accident in a sense when it says that the Arabic language will be one of the three official languages of the mandate. So I think that's when we begin to see how the powerful impact of a colonial period. After all, the end of the First World War did not see self-determination. It saw the idea of the mandate system in which these former Turkish territories were to be under the tutelage of, in inverted commas, an advanced nation, and Britain was that advanced nation. Of course, Britain then began to implement this mandate extremely badly. Its administration was quite chaotic. Which of course led not only to the inability to create the Jewish national home, but also in fact produced the Arab revolt in the 1930s.
Can we focus just for a moment on this idea of Palestinians per se, a culture, a nation? Because in many ways a Palestinian nationalism didn't exist 100 years ago.
Yes, because when the British and the French took over the Turkish colonies, essentially, of the Levant, there was no designated area called Palestine. What actually happened that the local inhabitants, as soon as the Ottomans had been defeated in Syria, Lebanon, and what is now Palestine, wanted to create one state, essentially a Syrian state. And in Damascus in 1920, in the spring of 1920, King Faisal declared independence. This was then brutally put down by the French in July of that year. And the Palestinian representatives to the General Syrian Congress returned to Palestine and said, "We have lost Syria, now we have to defend Palestine." And from that moment in the early 1920s period, the idea of a different sense of identity, not an identity of a wider identity, but of a much narrower Palestinian identity, began to develop.
But of course this all links into the bigger question. If you have a Jewish homeland then imposed on these people who may have been from other branches of Arab life, but were there for hundreds of years or thousands of years, could they say that there's a Palestinian soil?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, because I think if one looks at the way in which the mandate system worked in the Middle East, it's rather like saying, is there a Jordanian soil? Because after all, Jordan was created for the convenience of the British. In fact, it was as a consequence of Abdullah going to aid his brother in the Syrian uprising, the British intervened and said, why don't you come and run this small area and be the emir of a place called Transjordan?
Do you know what, Professor? I'm going to have to come back to you, because right now we have a short extract from Professor Strawson's latest book.
Palestinian and Israeli narratives thus both attempt to construct the other in such a way as to question its legitimacy in Palestine. Each narrative assumed the other had so little attachment to the country that if life were to become uncomfortable, it would leave. Both sides regarded the other's nationalism as fake, and thus it would fade.
And I am back now with Professor Strawson, the author of those fine, wise words there. We were talking earlier a little bit of the history of Palestinian nationalism. Let's now come a bit more up to date. Since 1948, this idea of a Palestinian patriot has ebbed and flowed, as has the occupation. Let's have a little look at what first happened in 48 to the Palestinian groups of people, if we can call them that.
Well, what was quite shocking, that the declaration by Israel, the Jewish state, in May 1948 was not accompanied by a similar declaration by the Palestinian National Movement of the state. And to some extent that was because of the divisions within the Arab world about what should happen. And of course, in the consequence of the the Israeli War of Independence and the Palestinian Nakba, we had the division of a real partition of Palestine, and not the one the United Nations imagined, in which Jordan, of course, took the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the Gaza was occupied by Egypt. And it was only very late in the day, during that period, in the September period, that, for instance, the Egyptians allowed a declaration of a Palestinian government to be articulated. And this very rapidly fell into nothing and didn't ever exercise any control. So basically, for the period from 1948 to 1967, the Palestinians were divided. The Jordanians were very against any sign of
divided within themselves.
Divided within themselves, divided geographically, either in Egypt, in Gaza under the Egyptian control, the West Bank under Jordanian control, or as refugees outside of those areas.
Can I just ask you, I mean, obviously this is on a political level, but on a personal level, with families and tribes who would have travelled across great swathes of historic Palestine, would they have considered themselves linked? Would a family in Gaza have had ancient links to a family in Hebron? Did they stretch that far?
Sometimes, yes. I mean, for instance, some refugees leaving Haifa, for example, Palestinian refugees, took boats to their family estates in Gaza. So there were connections. There were connections to that character. The important thing is that actually after the 1967 war, and strangely the reunification of what had been British Mandate Palestine under the Israeli occupation, that a new sense of Palestinian identity grew, and that the impact of being Jordanians, which for the West Bankers had been their main identity, and their passports, began to slip, and people began to resume the conception of being Palestinians.
Resuming it.
Resuming the idea of being Palestinians in the sense of the Palestinian identity which had been formed during the Mandate period.
Right. And today, again, a schism very clear between a growing identity being cut off in Gaza and the West Bank, with a Palestinian nationalism now.
Well, it's a great challenge for the international community and for the Palestinians, because international community has an obligation to the Palestinians, which it has obviously never discharged, though actually the United Nations Petition Resolution said that there would have to be an implementation even of that policy. And Palestinian nationalism is now, I think, in a very difficult state. Either you have the division between the geographical division between Gaza and the West Bank, and also you have the division between the refugees and the people in Palestine.
And that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much, Professor Strawson, for joining us.